Quincy Jones spent his life making music that felt like it came from somewhere ancient and unreachable. A DNA test in 2006 confirmed that it did. His maternal line traced directly to the Tikar people of Cameroon, an African people documented for centuries for one thing above all others: musical genius. But the Tikar were only the beginning. What the full results revealed about his ancestry reached across 4 continents, connected him to the first president of the United States, and raised a question no laboratory has yet been able to answer. This is the true ancestry of Quincy Jones. Before we dive in, comment where you are watching from and click subscribe. Quincy Delight Jones Jr. was born on March 14, 1933, on the south side of Chicago, one of the most racially segregated and economically pressurized urban environments in Depression-era America. The streets around him were organized by gang territory and policed by violence. He saw a man shot at a neighborhood drugstore, and he recalls the incident barely registering. By the time he was 7 years old, the South Side had already done its work of desensitization. His father, Quincy Sr., was a carpenter and a semi-professional baseball player from Charleston, South Carolina. His paternal grandmother had been an enslaved woman in Louisville, Kentucky. That fact, one generation back from his own father, placed the Jones family squarely inside a history that had not ended so much as changed its form. Charleston to Chicago was the Great Migration in miniature, a family moving north, carrying everything they could not leave behind, and leaving behind everything that could not be carried. His mother, Sarah, was something else entirely. University educated, multilingual, and fluent in stenography, she played piano and sang in the family's church. A neighbor who knew her described her as one of the smartest people she had ever encountered in her life. The description was not offered as a compliment in the ordinary sense. It was offered as a fact that made what came next harder to accept. When Quincy was young, Sarah suffered a schizophrenic breakdown. She was institutionalized. His father divorced her and eventually moved the family to Bremerton, Washington, where work was available at the Naval Shipyard. 10 people lived in 2 rooms. The South Side violence was replaced by a different kind of confinement. What saved him was a piano. When he was 7 years old, a neighbor named Lucy Jackson played stride piano in the apartment next door, and he listened through the wall. He got onto that piano and could not be kept away from it. Every cell in his body, he said later, told him that this was what the rest of his life was going to be. He had no way of knowing at the time where that certainty came from. The DNA would eventually point to exactly where. In 1977, Quincy Jones wrote the score for Roots. The miniseries ran for 8 consecutive nights on ABC and was watched by 130 million Americans, the largest television audience for a dramatic series in history at that point. It told the story of Kunta Kinte, an African man captured from his village in the Gambia and sold into slavery in America, and it followed his descendants across 7 generations to freedom. The source material was Alex Haley's book of the same name, which Haley had spent 12 years researching, and which rested on the claim, disputed by some historians but embraced by millions of readers, that he had traced his own family line back to a specific village in West Africa. Jones had worked with Haley before the series. In 1972, the 2 men had sat down together with a team of genealogical researchers from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Salt Lake City, an institution that had assembled one of the largest genealogical archives in the world and had attempted to trace Jones's own family history. What they found on his mother's side had stopped them both. His linear ancestors were French Huguenots who had immigrated to colonial America. Before immigrating, they had been court musicians in Europe. Music had run through that branch of his family for centuries before he was born, not as a pastime, not as a cultural inheritance in the general sense, but as a formal, documented, professional lineage stretching back to the courts of France. Jones found this extraordinary. He attributed some of his musical instinct to it directly. But the discovery also sharpened a question he had not previously been able to articulate with this kind of precision. The French Huguenot court musicians explained one thread. They did not explain the pull he had felt at 7 years old, listening through a wall to a neighbor's piano on the south side of Chicago. That pull felt older than France. It felt older than anything the European genealogy had surfaced. When Gates approached him about African American lives, Jones said yes, without hesitation. The other half of the answer was waiting. The Jones family arrived in Chicago as part of one of the largest voluntary migrations in American history. Between 1910 and 1970, approximately 6 million Black Americans left the South for northern and western cities: Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Los Angeles, New York. They left because the sharecropping economy had trapped them in a system designed to function as slavery's economic continuation. They left because Jim Crow law and the violence that enforced it had made ordinary life in the South a sustained condition of danger. They left because northern cities offered wages, anonymity, and the possibility, not always fulfilled and often brutally disappointed, of something different. Quincy Jones Sr. came from Charleston, South Carolina. Charleston is one of the most historically significant ports in the American slave trade. More enslaved Africans entered North America through Charleston than through any other port city. The records that survive from that trade document the numbers of people processed, the ships that carried them, the prices they were assessed at. They do not, in most cases, document where those people came from with the specificity that would allow a family tree to be traced. What the Jones family knew about its own origins before the DNA test was partial at best. Quincy Sr.'s mother had been enslaved in Louisville. His father had been Welsh, a white man who had fathered a child with an enslaved woman on a Kentucky plantation. Jones had traced this himself, following the documentary record as far as it would go. The Welsh grandfather had no name attached to him in the family history. He was a fact, not a person, present in the bloodline, and absent from any record that acknowledged what he had done or what it had produced. The documentary trail stopped there. Before the enslaved great-grandmother in Louisville, the record offered nothing. Which part of Africa her ancestors had come from, which port they had passed through, which ship had carried them, none of it was written down anywhere that genealogists had been able to find. The paper could not go further. Something else would have to. Henry Louis Gates Jr. had been thinking about this problem for years before he turned it into a television series. The question was not simply where African Americans came from in the broad geographic sense. That much was understood in approximate terms. West Africa, Central Africa, and the Atlantic coast ports that the slave trade had made into processing centers for human beings. The question was whether it was possible to go further, to move past the approximate and reach the specific, to replace West Africa with a people, a region, a cultural community whose history could be told and whose connection to a living American could be demonstrated with something more durable than family memory. Gates believed DNA could do what documents could not. The methodology his team built for African American lives was not the kind of consumer ancestry testing that was beginning to reach the market in the mid-2000s. It was a research-grade genetic analysis assembled specifically for the purpose, combining autosomal DNA testing, which captures ancestral contributions across all lines simultaneously, with mitochondrial DNA analysis, which follows the direct maternal line unchanged through every generation, and Y chromosome testing, which traces the direct paternal line. The African database they worked against had been constructed for the project by geneticist Rick Kittles, drawing on DNA samples from populations across sub-Saharan Africa. It was the most comprehensive resource of its kind available at the time. Without it, the results would have been percentages on a chart. With it, the percentages could be matched against specific populations, specific peoples, specific places, specific histories. When Quincy Jones's results came back, Gates reviewed them before presenting them on camera. The autosomal analysis returned a result consistent with what the team was finding across the series: 66% sub-Saharan African, 34% European, 0% Native American. The Y chromosome, tracing the direct paternal line through Jones's father and grandfather, showed only European ancestry, no African match. The Welsh grandfather, the man with no name in the family history, was the origin point of the Jones male line. Then Gates turned to the mitochondrial result, the direct maternal line, every mother's mother, unbroken, reaching back through time. What it found was not what anyone had anticipated. The mitochondrial result placed Quincy Jones's direct maternal line among the Tikar people of Cameroon. Gates presented this finding on camera with the specific care it deserved. The Tikar are a people of the Cameroon grasslands, the highland plateau in the western part of the country where a constellation of small kingdoms had developed over centuries, each with its own royal court, its own political structure, its own artistic tradition. What distinguished the Tikar across Central and West African history was not military power or territorial reach. It was something that does not typically appear in the indexes of history books. The Tikar people are documented across centuries of recorded observation by neighboring peoples, by Islamic scholars who traveled the trade routes of the Sahel, and eventually by European ethnographers, as a people whose culture was organized around music and artistic genius. Their royal courts were centers of musical performance. The instruments they built, the rhythms they organized, the ceremonial music that structured their public and spiritual life were considered extraordinary by people who had encountered music traditions across the continent. Their craftsmanship, bronze casting, beadwork, and carved wooden instruments was among the most sophisticated in the region. Music was not peripheral to Tikar civilization. It was definitional. Gates told Jones where his maternal line traced. Jones listened. He said afterward 4 words, "I would have never guessed." Then something else, a pause, and then recognition settled, not of something new, but of something that had always been present, finally being given a location on a map. The autosomal results also identified additional African ancestral connections beyond the Tikar. They included the Sukuma people of Tanzania, the Tonga of Mozambique, and the Fang of Equatorial Guinea. 4 distinct African peoples across 4 separate regions of the continent: Central Africa, East Africa, Southern Africa, and the Gulf of Guinea. Each represented an ancestral thread that entered the Jones bloodline through different routes, different time periods, different passages of the Atlantic trade. 4 peoples, 1 genome, all of them arriving across centuries of forced dispersal at a 7-year-old boy pressing his hands against a stranger's piano on the south side of Chicago. The African ancestry was documented. The European third required a different kind of accounting. 34% European, higher than the average for African Americans, which Gates's team was finding to be approximately 20% across the series participants. The excess had a source. Jones had already traced part of it himself. His paternal grandfather was Welsh, a white man who had fathered a child with an enslaved woman on a Kentucky plantation, produced a grandmother, who produced the father, who produced Quincy Jones. That line ran through the Y chromosome result, no African match, only European, and it represented the specific mechanism by which European DNA had entered the Jones bloodline on his father's side. On his mother's side, the European ancestry was older and, in genealogical terms, considerably stranger. Jones's linear ancestors were French Huguenots, Protestant refugees who had fled religious persecution in France and immigrated to colonial America in the 17th century. Before they immigrated, they had been court musicians. The Laniers had served in the musical establishments of European nobility for generations before the New World existed as a destination. Jones had traced this in 1972 with Alex Haley and had attributed some of his musical instinct to it explicitly. The court musicians of Huguenot France had found their way, through 2 centuries of American history, into the genome of a man from the south side of Chicago. The Lanier line also produced something the genealogists had not been expecting. Among Jones's documented ancestors, through his mother's European line, was Elizabeth Washington Lewis, known within her own family as Betty, the younger sister of George Washington, the only one of Washington's three sisters to survive to adulthood, a woman who had managed one of the largest estates in colonial Virginia and who had corresponded with her brother throughout the Revolutionary War. Quincy Jones was a documented relative of the first president of the United States, not through Washington himself, who left no surviving children, but through his sister, through a genealogical line that ran from colonial Virginia through the Lanier family and into the maternal ancestry of a black man whose grandmother had been born into slavery. That is not a metaphor for American history. That is American history. What the genome assembled, taken as a whole, is a document that no archive contains. On one side, the Tikar musicians of Cameroon, a people whose civilization was organized around musical excellence for centuries before the Atlantic trade began pulling people from that part of the continent. On another, the court musicians of Huguenot France, a family of professional performers whose descendants fled religious persecution and remade themselves in colonial America. Two musical lineages from opposite sides of the world converging in a single bloodline through the specific violence and displacement that produced the United States. Between those two lines, the mechanisms of that convergence are not difficult to identify. A Welsh man on a Kentucky plantation fathered a child with an enslaved woman. Her descendants carried that bloodline north to Chicago. The Lanier line, court musicians turned Confederate soldiers, carried European ancestry into the same family from the maternal side. These were not unions, they were transactions, coercions, the ordinary operations of a system that did not require consent and did not record what it produced. What that system produced, in this case, was Quincy Jones. The pull he felt at 7 years old, pressing his hands against Lucy Jackson's piano through a wall in a Chicago housing project, now has a geography. The Tikar grasslands of Western Cameroon, the courts of pre-revolutionary France. Both of those traditions, one African, one European, separated by an ocean and by centuries of entirely different histories, arrived at the same place at the same time inside the same child. Jones spent his career being described as a natural, a prodigy, someone for whom music arrived not as a skill to be learned, but as a language already known. The DNA does not explain that. Nothing does. But it establishes that the inheritance was real, that it was ancient, and that it had traveled a very long distance across the Atlantic, across the American South, across the Great Migration, to reach a boy who heard a piano through a wall and understood, without instruction, that he already knew how to speak that language. What he built from that understanding is what the next chapter concerns. He died on November 3rd, 2024, at the age of 91. By then, he had received 80 Grammy nominations, more than any artist in the history of the Recording Academy, and had won 28 of them. He had scored more than 30 films. He had produced 3 of the best-selling albums ever recorded. He had organized We Are the World, written the score for Roots, created The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, and spent 7 decades moving through American music with a fluency that his collaborators Frank Sinatra, Miles Davis, Michael Jackson, Ray Charles, Ella Fitzgerald, and Stevie Wonder consistently describe as something that could not be fully taught or fully explained. The opening of this video made a claim that the music felt like it came from somewhere ancient and unreachable, and that a DNA test confirmed it did. The Tikar of Cameroon are that somewhere. Their musical traditions reach back through centuries of documented Central African history to a civilization that treated musical excellence not as talent but as inheritance, something passed through royal courts, through generations of performers, through a culture that had organized itself around the production and preservation of music long before any contact with the outside world had begun. That inheritance entered the Atlantic trade. It crossed an ocean in circumstances that were not recorded because the people who organized the crossing were not interested in what they were destroying. It survived in a genome that eventually produced a child in a Chicago housing project who pressed his hands against a stranger's piano at age 7 and felt in every cell of his body that he already knew what he was doing. The DNA established the connection. The career confirmed it across 7 decades and 80 Grammy nominations in a body of work that shaped what American music sounds like to the rest of the world. Quincy Jones did not need the DNA test to be who he was, but the test said something worth saying, that the music did not begin with him, that it had been traveling toward him for a very long time, and that where it came from, once you know, changes how you hear everything he made. The Tikar people of Cameroon have been known for musical genius for centuries. Quincy Jones's maternal line traces directly to them. His European ancestors include French Huguenot court musicians, Confederate soldiers, and a documented relative of George Washington. His paternal grandmother was an enslaved woman on a Kentucky plantation. All of it converged in one man, one genome, one career, one body of work that reshaped American music across 7 decades. The DNA established that the music was never accidental. Where it came from, the science can now name. Why it sounded the way it did is a question no laboratory will ever answer.